Now, what can be done to neutralize this? What can be done to move our foreign policy away from the bipartisan disaster that we've had, certainly under Clinton, and then Bush, and then Barack Obama, but for that matter, going back much, much earlier as well? I think it takes an enormous amount of education. You have to get people away from the most naive kind of left-right dichotomies, and you have to show them, regardless of what differences you may have in the domestic front, regardless of what your thoughts on other issues might be, on foreign policy, it certainly is not serving the cause of traditional morality or conservatism or small government to have this imperial outreach policy of going out and putting troops in other countries, trying to nation build and create democracy. In fact, all of that is antithetical to traditional values that conservatives have claimed to be in favor of. All of that can only expand government massively. It certainly has the effect that's very detrimental on family values. Look at the families that have been split apart by U.S. policy. Whenever you have husbands torn away from wives and children to be sent to fight in a foreign land, and you've seen just extraordinary deployments over the course of this so-called war on terror, where fathers have been sent for several redeployments, including people in the National Guard who they join the National Guard because they want to be a kind of backup, a kind of support for legitimate military operations. And for that matter, they want to do things like helping out after Katrina and whatnot. There are a lot of reasons why people get involved in the National Guard. And certainly by doing so, they are committing themselves into the power of somebody else, an establishment which may abuse their commitment. But the idea that these people, who are usually just businessmen and family men, would be taken away from their families for extended deployments in war zones that are really not essential or even helpful, in fact are detrimental to the American interest, is just monstrous. And it's something that conservatives above all should see why this is a disaster for traditional family values. And then of course we've seen all kinds of things happen with women in the military as well. This is something that conservatives had opposed throughout up until the 1990s, basically. You didn't hear so much about it though once the Iraq War began. I noticed conservatives started to mute their criticism of the idea that you would have women in combat. But you've had these horrible stories of women POWs and and for that matter, women in the military who've been abused by contractors in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. It's just extraordinary. I mean, it's clearly the absolute antithesis of what conservatives say they believe in terms of morality, at home and anywhere else. And of course, as I've already said, in terms of small government, it's just hardly even something you can comment on. It's just the most, if you think correctly that the United States federal government should not be running schools, local schools, or even private schools, certainly, here in the United States, what on earth makes you think that you can go up and set an education system, a sewage system, a police system, go have the United States federal government go to Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen now and try to set up, basic civil services there? It just doesn't make any sense from a small government or, libertarian perspective or conservative perspective. On the left, on the other hand, I think it's quite clear that none of these wars are advancing human rights or advancing the kinds of things that liberals typically say they believe in. What's actually happening is that you're having mass death, brought not only by actual military operations, by what's called collateral damage, where civilians are killed by bombs dropped from airplanes or through drones, but also there's this sort of wider kind of collateral damage in the form of the destabilization that's created by any of these invasions and any of these operations, which winds up basically creating the conditions of a civil war. And that's what you saw in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a terrible, terrible dictator. He was, the pinnacle of state brutality, sure. But what came after him as a result of U.S. intervention was also pretty much equally the same pinnacle of brutality, because you then had factions within this country fighting to try to control the central government and just doing amazing amounts of torture and brutality. And all of this was created by the fact that the United States got in there. If you leave well enough alone, what you actually find is that the natural tendency is for people not to want to live under dictatorship, not to want to have their lives and their property and certainly their families abused by dictators. You've seen this in Iran, for example, where clearly the Iranians gradually want to move to a system that is less oppressive than the one they have now. But every time the United States gets involved in that, every time the United States tries to push the Iranians further in that direction, all it can do is create a backlash that actually stops the entire process. So I think on liberal grounds, on conservative grounds, and certainly on libertarian grounds, our foreign policy has been a complete disaster. And that's something that really we should bring everyone together to be able to say that we need an alternative. The reason we don't yet have an alternative, though, in part it's because perhaps of the sort of ill will of the foreign policy leadership. There's, as Tom Woods has alluded to in his talk here at the event this week, there's an enormous amount of money being made through these military-industrial complex affiliates. There's a lot of money involved in military contracting. There's a lot of money involved for things like Blackwater, and that certainly does have a tremendously distorting effect on our entire political system here at home, and it encourages us to get into these wars. But there's also the fact that the foreign policy establishment is almost brainwashed by its own corruption. It's become so stuck in a series of ideas about intervention and nation building which do not work. But nonetheless, it's not able to think of any alternatives. By sheer force of habit, it has indoctrinated itself as much as it's indoctrinated the country. So there's really a need for a great deal of innovative foreign policy thought. Certainly, libertarians have been doing good work on that for a very long time. Some conservatives, non-interventionist conservatives of the kind of Robert Taft school have been doing very well also. But there's a need for a kind of 1,000 flowers to bloom in terms of new approaches to foreign policy that get us away from this hyper-interventionism. And some of the new approaches may be things that I disagree with, but they are things that I think we all need to look at, just any possible alternative, even if it's simply harm reduction at first, rather than going back to a completely non-interventionist foreign policy. Even if it's just a matter of, okay, some people might make an argument for staying in places like Europe and Japan, which I think is a bad idea, but that's not nearly as bad as the idea of trying to, extend U.S. power to the frontiers of Russia itself, or even within Russia. Who knows what might be the next step. It's certainly not as bad as going to war in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen.